Welcome to the James Connolly Festival 2021, and today we're going to be talking about post-COVID arts and culture. I'm Michelle Byrne, and I'm here as a representative from the Trade Union Left Forum. We're a forum that is a space for trade union activists to have those hard debates, a class-based analysis on some trade union issues of the day and what's happening organising in the country. We're delighted to be here as part of this panel, facilitating this great discussion with you all. And I suppose it's really important to have this as a space in itself, because obviously the COVID crisis has had a disproportionately affecting artists. You know, there's obviously the precarity of work for artists even before COVID, and now that's obviously been highlighted more. And as well, like what the effects are of COVID when it comes to people's creativity as well. So I'm joined on the panel by many different art practices, which is great to see. We have Emmet, who is an actor, playwright, screenwriter, who is known for many of his writings. Many might know for the Dublin Old School. And we have Eoghan O'Neill, who is we have Eoghan O'Neill, who is a musician and author of The Capitalist Illusion and a member of the CPI. And we have Ozzy O'Connor, who works in film photography and is communications officer for the new union Praxis. So Ozzy, we might get started with yourself. You've been involved in starting up an exciting new project, Praxis, a new artists union. I know this idea was kind of born pre-COVID, but you've just recently gone public. Would you like to chat a bit more about that?
Sure. So thank you very much for having me. I think one of the highlights for many members of Praxis in 2020 was the union. Like you said, we originally tried to set it up at the end of February, mid-March, I believe. And it was essentially spearheaded by Kirwan and was set up in 84 Sounds. And it was essentially this kind of forum where a few dozen artists all kind of got together and discussed workplace issues, pay issues, different kind of concerns working as an artist from all different disciplines as well, which was very important to us. And so pretty much the last physical meeting we had, the week afterwards we went back into lockdown, or into the first lockdown even. So a very interesting time, and so we essentially moved everything digitally. And before then we had collectively agreed to work on building an actual union off the back of those kind of 4-week projects. So it was, the 12, 13 months of organising. We had an incredible reception. I think 400 artists across Ireland had expressed interest in joining. And so we've been trying to kind of pick up those numbers since we've launched. Like I said, we represent every kind of discipline. So musicians, dancers, choreographers, filmmakers, poets, writers, and we are the first artists union in Ireland to represent such a broad amount of disciplines. Which is very important, because what we realised in that original kind of 4-week course or kind of forum was that issues we were dealing with were similar across the board. They were issues with not getting paid on time and not getting paid properly, being forced to cover your own expenses for different projects, not getting contracts, being asked to work for exposure, or essentially being kind of forced in certain circumstances to work for exposure without pay. You're competing with a lot of free labour that was being used throughout kind of both private and publicly funded arts organisations and different sectors. So a massive bunch of issues that we all kind of realised that we needed a union, and not a campaign group either. There's plenty of very promising campaign groups in Ireland dealing with different kind of arts and culture issues, but we wanted an actual democratic representation of workers, which was super important. So we launched there at the end of March officially. We got great press reception, including this, which is all fantastic. There's been a lot of discussion around the campaign that we launched with as well, which was around the application procedure for the Arts Council of Ireland. Our members at our first AGM at the beginning of March voted that it was unfit for purpose, and we are hoping to work with the Arts Council to build a system that is more artist-centred.
Great, and it's great to hear actually, and I saw some of it myself, the mainstream media actually covering a launch like this. Quite unusual that workers' struggles would get such a page coverage in mainstream media, so fair play. And how have you found organising online, particularly starting up a union? How have you found that? Have you faced any challenges?
I'd say the challenges that everyone else did in 2020, the roller coaster of highs and lows of lockdowns and sneaky pints wherever you can get them. We're very privileged to have an amazing set of activists and organisers and artists, not only from all different disciplines, but all different kind of organising backgrounds. So like I'm a trained shop steward with Unite the Union, and we have people in the organisation that would have worked very heavily with the two referendum campaigns, different kind of housing activist groups, political organisations and so on and so forth. So we really have a real melting pot of different kind of political ideologies, different organising backgrounds, which made it a much easier process than anything else. And I think that kind of collective education of a lot of people that work in the arts really fed into the establishment of the union. I mean, we originally set up before COVID hit, and throughout the last 12, 13 months, it's been a real reminder as to why we needed it. And so as far as digital organising goes and Zoom meetings, it could have been a lot worse.
Absolutely, and I know you were born out of the back of A4 Sounds, not literally in the back of the building, but like in one of the rooms. And it's been interesting to see, like obviously it started off in Dublin, but probably actually this online organising has let you grow in a much more kind of like island-wide way than if it was just maybe based in one specific location, which is great. Great opportunities there. The campaign that you've launched, can you tell us a little bit more about that? It's around funding, and isn't it?
Sure. So it's essentially around the application procedure for the Arts Council of Ireland. Obviously, there's lots of issues around funding. I believe we spend half the percentage of GDP on our arts and culture sector compared to the rest of the EU. So that's obviously a separate issue. But as far as the ability to actually get these grants that are being made is an issue in and of itself. So from many discussions that we've had with members, it's been around access, it's been around language and your understanding of language and using certain terminology that resonates with the Arts Council, and you essentially need to do a lot of box ticking, which essentially involves you coming from a privileged enough background to understand this terminology, to have X, Y and Z degrees, and to also not have any reading or writing disabilities or issues around language or issues around sight. And so there's kind of a multitude of kind of problems. One of the big ones as well around the applications for the Arts Council would be the fact that artists don't really see any funding from actually filling out the applications, which can take up to a month for some artists. We have a campaign going with members trying to count up the numbers, some of them going up to 100-200 hours spent on an application. Whereas you have workers in arts organisations who would get paid an hourly rate to make these applications out. So ultimately you have this massive disparity between people getting paid to make these applications and people not getting paid to make these applications. Because ultimately the system as it is isn't artist-centred, it isn't worker-centred, and that's hopefully what we want to achieve working with the Arts Council. Absolutely,
that's a lot of unpaid work that people are doing in order to try and maybe get funding, which is very risky. Like, if you're trying to figure out which grant then would be best to do and which takes the quickest amount of time, you're more likely to get. That's a scary place to be. And is there any other campaigns that you are looking at in the future once, obviously I'm just going to assume that you're going to be successful in this campaign. Where do you see yourselves going next?
So we had a couple of very interesting debates at our first AGM at the beginning of March. There was a few things brought up. The things that stand out in my mind were like making sure that it wasn't a Dublin-centred organisation, especially given the fact that a lot of artists get pushed out of urban areas. It was very important to focus on rural areas and towns and villages throughout Ireland, understanding that the local authorities there are just as to blame for a lack of kind of arts funding as any kind of major urban centres. We also kind of wanted to reiterate that it is an Ireland-wide organisation as well. The issues that we kind of originally discussed in A4 Sounds were around like contracts and gender disparity and those kind of things, which are near identical across the border. So it was very important that we weren't too Dublin-centred. As well as that, we voted against CETA and kind of had a very interesting discussion around what's our place in it and what's the discussion happening nationally. And so we wanted to kind of reiterate that these kind of big trade union discussions need to incorporate artists, and these kind of big political discussions and big kind of trade discussions need to incorporate artists who are very often left out of these talks.
Absolutely, because it affects artists in a different way to other members of society, but also artists can bring a whole other different design thinking to a lot of the solutions to these problems as well, which I think would be very much appreciated. Thanks so much for that, Ozzy. Emmet, so you are an actor in a COVID society and a post-COVID society, hopefully. What has your lived experience been being an actor and screenwriter during all of these difficulties?
What's happened is that, everything just went dark. Instantaneously, from March last year. I remember the being at a show and saying, and the show itself was a miniature festival, was happening next door in the Project Art Centre, and it was gone, you know, and at the time everybody was imagining some sort of short, sharp break that would happen and everything would skip back out. So artists had to become quite flight-footed in changing what they're like, changing how they're going to make money. And then as things got worse, the situation just got worse for every actor. There's a lot more film production going on, but a lot of the time that can only kind of benefit people that have a very, very established career. Theatres are the place, the kind of proving grounds for many actors that don't have a lot of experience, a lot of young actors coming out. People are training and coming out into the world, and there's no, theatres are dark, so there's nowhere for them to go. So it's quite a despairing time. People get timed out anyway in the arts career. You know, you get to your 30s, you look at your career and you say, do I really want to keep on paying €1,500, now gone up to €2,000 a month in a city that I can't get work in? So there's been a huge exodus actually from centres of culture and cities, major city spaces, of people in theatre and artists out towards the country, because the city has become unlivable because there is no work, you know. So it's pretty desperate times for a lot of actors, and especially theatre artists and practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, can you see a way out of this? Like, how can we end this precarious nature that was already established even before COVID hit?
I think it's different for actors, because sometimes if you are an actor and acting is all you do, what do you do when that entire thing is taken away? So for them, they're just kind of chomping at the bit and being told, you know, you just have to wait it out. Like, we're sorry. There was a kind of idea when COVID first started that all artists would kind of go into a type of deep freeze and they'd go off and create lots of stuff and then they'd come out the other side of it. But as anyone has experienced, like the pandemic, that's not how art happens. It only happens in conversations like this, you know, when you meet people in a workspace or an art space, and you can have conversations where you bounce ideas off each other. Zoom fatigue kicks in, you know what I mean? So I think that it's happening. People are creating. More funding has come in, which has allowed people that have never got funding before to get funding. So I'm hopeful in that sense. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about the ability, my ability even, like, to kind of be very creative in the middle of a pandemic. I've found it quite difficult, you know.
It's interesting you mentioned Zoom, because it's not like we had Zoom and other Great Depressions, so we didn't have that Zoom fatigue problem then, but we did see a lot of art coming from it.
Yeah.
And I suppose, like, what do you see the type of art coming out now is changing?
It's not, like it's. I know. I don't think so. I think really people are just waiting for kind of things to get back to normal so they can kind of, you know. I think there was a pivot towards digital online. I'm coming from a theatre practitioner. This is my experience. You know, the Abbey kind of did a thing where Ireland's Call, where people wrote and made things, but like ultimately, you're asking people to kind of retrain, you know what I mean, and work in another sector that they might not have any kind of expertise in. And that's the real kind of like capitalist model. That's like, you're 60 and Debenhams have closed, here's some money, you could get into IT, you know, that kind of way. Like, so it's kind of a thing of just helping and supporting people to get through the pandemic, and then hopefully when they get on the other side, because not everybody can be creative. Maybe you don't feel like being creative because, you know, it's a pretty depressing time. So the kind of idea that everybody's just going to skip out the door with like 5 plays written, you know,
locked up in their room, coming up with all the good ideas. But some people might say that there might be some hope at the end of the tunnel. Like, there's suggestions now around universal basic income for artists. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah,
like, I suppose we were going to chat. I was going to chat a little bit about this, just about the history of it, because I had been reading about it a good bit before it was being trialled on artists, and it's a conversation that's nearly about, well, it's a few thousand years old, really. It goes back to the Romans, but Britain brought in a number of laws in the late 18th century called the Spleen-Hamland laws, and it gave poor people a certain amount of grain so that they wouldn't fall below a particular level of poverty. But the reason it was brought in was because the market system at the time was failing. So there was a 50-year period where they gave this grain, and any time free money is given to poor people, there's moralising around it. And the same thing happened like 200, 300 years ago. That happens now when you give poor people money. The idea was that people would become feckless and indolent, and there was a population explosion. So what they did was they got rid of the Spleen-Hamland laws and they brought in the Dickensian workhouses, and we know how that kind of all worked out. They blamed them for a population explosion as well in the poor people within the poor population of the UK. But there was a population explosion here in Ireland as well, and we didn't have the spleen hamland laws, so there actually was no correlation. It was just one of those things again where it fed into people of means and their hatred towards poor people, you know. So in the 1960s there was a thing called the Ad Hoc Commission on the Triple Revolution, and one of the aspects of that was cybernation, or automation as we now call it. And they were terrified that as the American economy and Western economies moved into a consumer-based or services-based economy, that essentially workers were going to lose their jobs to robots. And the main job of everybody was to be a consumer. So they decided, instead of the consumer base collapsing, let's give everybody some money. And Nixon was going to do this, but then somebody pointed out the spleen hamland laws to him, and he bottled it. But it's amazing, like people like George W. Bush and Clinton were all in favour of this back then in the 70s, of giving people a base below which they couldn't fall. I'll come back to this in a second, but Marx was against this because he felt that it gave a floor to employers that they couldn't fall below. So fast forward to today. A lot of kind of tech bros really love this kind of idea, because what happened in the late 1970s was they didn't give people UBI, but they gave them credit cards. And then we got the credit crash, and then we got deregulation, and then in 2008, obviously, we all know what happened. But a lot of tech bros have written books about this, and it's a big idea amongst a lot of billionaires. But some people feel that, again, there's a morality to that as well, where they basically want to feel okay about the fact that the disparity that's happening on a global scale, they can feel okay about earning billions while people don't earn anything. So fast forward to kind of like now, you know, again, it's more a symptom. The idea of UBI finding traction again is more a symptom of the fact that the market isn't working and the invisible hand isn't actually giving everybody what their just deserts. So, not that I'm skeptical about it. What happens with artists is, in Britain, for example, in the post-war period and all the way up to the 80s, they kind of had a benevolent welfare system that allowed working class artists to thrive. The Beatles, you know, Albert Finney, all these kind of you know, working class artists that would have come up at that time. And then when Thatcher got rid of that kind of benevolence in the welfare system, art in the UK, as we see now, and especially in acting, if you want to go to drama school, it will cost you £60,000 by the time you're finished. And then they only have 5 places for people from poor backgrounds to actually get in. But you have to be exceptional at the age of 18 and really know yourself, you know. And then when you get out then, if you don't get this and you're from a poor background, you could have €60,000 worth of debt. So what's happening in the UK, what's happening in America is people that don't live in a city centre and have to travel up can't. And if you go in and you get a degree in you know, arts, there's no guarantee you're going to make money. And if they get rid of tour level education fees, as they are creepingly trying to do here, people will not take on arts degrees because they won't be able to fund the life afterwards or pay back any of the money that they've made. And what happens is the arts and the culture becomes incredibly monocultural, because only certain people can go to college, get arts degrees. So again, just to touch on the UBI, it will be helpful to artists in Ireland because of the labyrinthine nature of the social welfare system. But we've seen with the PUP, it was out for only like 2 months. And within 2 months, the conversation changed to, there's people scamming this now. And and you know what I mean? Like, they can't help themselves. They just cannot help themselves. This folk devil that they have created of the sneaky, you know, feckless, indolent person, or, you know, single parent who just doesn't want to work, or, you know, a lazy pot-smoking artist. I'm quoting them now, you know. I'm down with the kids. Jazz cigarettes, that's what they call them nowadays. You know, so like so UBI is being trialled, but I think there's a reason why it's being trialled with artists as opposed to any other social group in Ireland. We go to the same parties as these politicians do. We talk sometimes the way these politicians do. They ask us to speak at events and stuff like that. So we're the acceptable face of poverty, because artists in this country have essentially been turned into a beggar class that has to keep going, like with a cup going, please give me more, because the market doesn't reward art. And when you are appealing to a bunch of neoliberals to give you more money, their answer is, well, if you make good art, you'd make good money, you know what I mean? But that, we know that's nonsense, that fucking Avengers Endgame will make all the money and Parasite will be the thing that people will admire, but it won't make the same kind of cash. Such is the nature of art. So Sorry, I'm going on now, but just to wrap up, the thing is, most artists will be educated to a particular level, but another grouping within society, let's say, for example, single parents, their single parent payment gets cut when a child reaches the age of 7. The good thing about the UBI is lots of artists are single parents who will be timed out and can't actually keep being artists, you know what I mean? They have to make a choice sometimes between having children or keep doing what they're doing. So it's great for people, and it kind of gets rid of all of the bureaucracy of the social welfare system of going in and having to explain yourself. But I'd rather they just kind of, but basically the point I would like to make about the whole thing is UBI is great for artists, but only if they give it to everybody. But I'm not 100% about it, because I don't know if it's just about keeping this system going for longer than maybe it should if it was just allowed to kind of fall apart, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying there about like trying to keep up those appearances with the political class, you know, in order to keep up with them. And I suppose a lot of your work actually kind of centres around working class lives.
Yeah.
But I've also heard the argument of like, you know, oh well, the arts and the arts communities are a factor in the creation of like kind of gentrification in cities. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like what happened was artists are always trying to sell themselves as profit makers to government departments and how much the arts actually gives to the economy. And it's not that it's a fool's errand, but what happens is like what happened with COVID. When tourism stopped, we went down with the ship as well, you know. So when we tied our mast or whatever, our sail to that kind of particular ship of tourism, what happens in terms of gentrification, and like the place that we're sitting in right now, I lived in an apartment just on this road, and there's 7 apartments, and all of them were designed for artists. They were built for artists. They're kind of very moderate 1-bedroom apartments that you were supposed to live and work in. Every single one of those apartments is in the hand of a hotelier or a publican or a professional who lives down the country, like absentee landlords. And what happened in the regeneration of Temple Bar, for example, people come in, disused buildings, artists used them. This was a place for radicals, leftists, feminists, queer radicals who were trying to change the law in Ireland. And it was this like pot of all these like brilliant bit of subversive kind of energy and art was all being created. So the government came in, they regenerated the place because the artists make the buildings that are no longer in use viable. But then what happens is tourists start to come to see the artists, and then after a while the artists don't actually own the property, and this is what it all comes back to. We don't own the buildings, but we've regenerated the buildings, and then as soon as we regenerate them, we make them viable again, and then the person who owns them goes, oh well, actually I'd like to turn this into an experience culture, so now your art studio is actually going to make me more money as a Starbucks. So what happens is we become the unwitting agents, not just of regeneration but then of gentrification, because it all starts with art and then it ends in real estate. And local governments and national governments on a whole don't want to own property anymore. They don't want to own buildings, they don't want to own anything. They want to give it over to somebody else to manage for them. So even like these kind of cultural institutions around Temple Bar, some of them are now empty, or they've been sold off, or they've tried to distance themselves. So when people talk about regeneration, I'm always just, my back goes up, because I'm like, watch out. They did it to us in 2008. All these spaces all around Dublin, Block T, all these kind of places were regenerated by artists. But as soon as the thing changed, they didn't own it. The artists were turfed out and the place was twirled down, and they threw up something else in its place, you know. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's a really interesting, like, to hear you talk about it like that, because I'm living in a smaller city in Waterford, where there's new cultural quarters coming in. So we're at the starting point now and we can already see where it's going to go. Artists are going to be pushed out into kind of lower priced accommodation, and they're not going to be able to be in those cultural quarters.
And what happens is, but I think the conversation for us as artists is, that from the get-go, we say, well, if we're going to come into this place and turn it into a theatre, or we're going to come into this place and turn it into a cinema or a dance studio or not, who owns this building? Because I will be arsed if I am regenerating this building and making a viable building while you let it rot for 20 years. You know, because like what happens is these places, leaving a building rotten is like antisocial behaviour. You know, like but the landlords and landowners are allowed to leave places disused in town centres for 20 years. That, like, if you were to leave some kind of rubbish on the side of the road, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. So artists come in, we regenerate it, we keep the place running for them, like keep the heat on maybe. I know of artists like had places down beside the Byrne Shaw, like took over a disused building, completely regenerated it, turned it around. But then as soon as it became viable again, they got turfed out. So we need to have those conversations about who owns this building, who owns the property, who owns the land. And until they give artists the land and the property that we have, and they can't just, we kind of like, I was kind of think of it as a post-apocalyptic film, we're like going from like what's a Terminator? We can only move at night. So it's like we go into the building, we regenerate it, and then scurrying from building to building, and then we just keep getting pushed out and then replaced, So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that concept of like leaving vacant buildings open is antisocial behaviour. It's really interesting when you see the guards always kind of intercepting youth who are doing antisocial behaviour, but yet they'll leave that building go and in fact protect it to be empty. When we've seen people being evicted during protests or highlighting empty buildings, they've got involved then, but yet we're happy to leave it. Yeah, leave it.
Yeah, they'll come in and you attack property rights and they'll come in and they'll crack the bats. That's the thing. Yeah. So it's about property. It's about who owns it, and it's about a number of other things about basically constitutionality around property rights. And stuff.
But I think your point around like that kind of people-owned arts scene is really important, and like I think that kind of there's lots that we can imagine around that as well.
Yeah.
Owen, I might chat to you as well. So you're a musician, and I'd love to hear what your experience has been in COVID as well.
Yeah, I suppose there's very much parallels to Emmet's kind of what's happened there with musicians. Like March came along, like we had I played a couple of bands. I put a big tribute band and then an original band, and we had our calendar full for the year, and then just it's gone, and like the industry just obliterated, and a lot of my mates that are musicians, similar things, just everything's gone, and obviously the music industry and like a lot of arts industry, it's so precarious that I'm a musician. I've been playing music for over 20 years, but I haven't been able to build a full-time career where I can say on a census that I'm a musician. Like I have a full-time job as well, but it's just that there's no stability in music, unless you're one of those, I get the record deal, I made the break, I'm successful. So like success measured in, I've got the the album, record label. So yeah, it's been difficult, and like it's not even just about not being able to gig. It's there's so many different aspects. Like it's the social element of not being able to jam, rehearse with band members and all that sort of stuff. And another thing that Emmet pointed to was the creativity aspect. Like people think that we've all this time now, like because it's mad. Like our lives are so busy, and you think, okay, I have all this time now to be creative. But like I said, it's not like a tap that you just go, okay, I've all this free time, because there's, we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and worries about families and friends, and it wasn't that creative stream that was just like, yeah, we're all making albums, making singles, whatever like that. So it has been stunted, but I do feel like there's probably a lag happening where the struggles going forward will be represented in music and different type of art forms. In the next couple of years, I just don't think it's been particularly creative, because I just don't think the social aspect has been there, because that's how music creators and different arts work. It's been collaborative. It's been there playing. Like we're in the middle of trying to record an album, and we have been able to work in the studio, even just work out different parts. It's all like section. So it's been very difficult, but like you just have to continue and continue to make the stuff that we do, that we love, because that's ultimately that's what we as artists and creative people is just that there's a drive for it because you have a passion for it, and that's why so many people are make no money but will fucking do it for for as long as possible. But I do think it's hard to tell now, but there definitely people will have left the industry. They just can't sustain it and will question, like what's the point of me busting my balls and doing this type of stuff when there's just no future for it. And I think the system in Ireland, it isn't a sustainable creative system for artists, and that's just the way it is. And until there's some sort of like these conversations actually happen within the artists themselves, there won't be a change, because I don't think we can just go to the gatekeepers of funds and expect it to creative arts to flourish. It's a conversation. It's organised. It's building. It's questioning. Why do we have a precarious industry? Like, it's not just about music, but film and theatre, painting, whatever it is. Just so many people are struggling. We have so many people that are creative, but so many people are struggling. So that conversation has to happen, and I think it will, because it's the material conditions that really change people's views on society.
Yeah, and it's almost hard to hear you make that reflection, like, of people questioning whether it's worth it or not, because it's without question that the arts have got me through this pandemic. Everyone out there listening to their music as they go on their 5-kilometre walks around the place, or reading in all this spare time that people have. But it's definitely interesting, and even recording must be really difficult. But I suppose there's lots of things, and it goes back to the whole that Zoom narrative of there's only so much that can happen in a Zoom, but it's the stuff that happens outside the Zoom, like something that you write on a napkin over a pint after a couple of chats, and the creative juices start flowing, and that kind of energy that you get when you're with someone. So I can't imagine how all of that has kind of stunted a lot of that as well. And I can imagine obviously
like some people obviously they can work on that, but not everyone is comfortable. I suppose a lot of how bands have gone into social media has taken a real front foot here, and a lot of people don't want to show what they've had for breakfast, just to gain. It's almost like you're catching. You have to have not just be a great musician, great writer, but you have to be a marketeer. You have to have everything in play, and you have to show your life. Otherwise, you won't get the fans. It's like there's this transition has happened where, rather than the record label coming out with the A&R and actually putting in money into building up artists that are rough and ready, the artists now have to take all the risk and have to build this brand. It's like you have to be ready for consumption. You have to be ready for export. We don't want to put in the money, and then once the band is ready to go, okay, we'll give you the record label or whatever like that. But so it is a struggle for for people that if the social media isn't the thing, but people get on. There's people get on with what they do. There's no kind of choice about it.
Yeah, you're almost expected to be professional marketers as well as musicians, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll tell you, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting what Emmet was saying around universal basic income as well. The Musicians Union of Ireland, Equity, have actually come out saying that they do support universal basic income, but I suppose from a CPI perspective, the position is, that universal basic services is probably a better angle to look at. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose with universal basic services, it's I think, listen, we all have our basic needs, our basic wants, and I think if it's focused on a sum of money, who's to set the universal basic income, on whose level, what's the level that will meet the needs of society. And I think really if it's about a certain amount of euro, then there isn't much of a need then for governments to actually provide the services. So I think if the idea of a universal basic income is to come in, it has to be first of all founded upon universal basic services, because I think that's one of the major problems with artists is it's not just that there isn't enough income, it's the cost of living, it's the cost of mortgages, housing, services, healthcare, dental care, all this sort of stuff that's part of our daily lives. So it's, like I said, there's obviously some positives to having a certain amount of income, but it's a wider discussion, and like Emmet pointed to a lot of the history that I was aware of, and I think that's it's important to not just take something at face value, that we actually have to understand who's actually driving these things, and whose interest is it going to serve ultimately? If the artists have come together and have this discussion, and the general theory is it's a good thing, well, maybe it's in the interest of the artists. Well, there's more of something to be said for it. But if it's been driven with an ulterior motive, then we have to question it. And basically, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a society that's it's cultural, it's economic, it's political, social. So until we actually have those basic needs, wants, and services, essential services, I think there's priorities to be made.
I think it's a band-aid that people need now, because like a lot of us, and I know we're all probably in this kind of thing, like when the pandemic happened, everybody's money, like as an artist, that they got was gone. So it's there to kind of give you cash to get you through. But I'm in total agreement with you. Like, it needs to be coupled with further down the line, instead of actually sorting out kind of services. Well, we'll just give you some money so that we can keep things as they are. Yeah. But at the moment, it will help people. It will help people that can't get disability, for example. 90% of people that actually apply for disability don't get it. Like if you have, like, let's say migraines or fibromyalgia or some other kind of mental illness, you can't get disability. So what do you do? So in those kind of situations is good, but I'd rather they sort that out as well, coupled with it, you know what I mean, as kind of just the trialling of artists. Yeah, also there is the thing of just paying artists.
Well, that's crazy. That's
like,
crazy talk.
Fucking wild shit. Like, it's just like, it's like you'll get, and as he hit it on it, and the union did as well, like, it's great exposure. It's like, I can't pay my landlord with exposure. And the fact of the matter is that there are people making money in this country from art, and our government benefits greatly from our art that we create as a branding opportunity for the entire country. But often we are the ones who are left not being remunerated for that hard work, or we don't get paid for it until we're dead. You know what I mean? Like, so that kind of shit happens.
There's a case in point, like IMRO brought out a report in 2017 looking at value of music. 700 million was the kind of the gross figure of brought into the economy. Only 200 million was actually filtered down into the artists, and then obviously you have a small minority of those artists actually, say U2, Hozier would be in, and they'd obviously take a lot of that. So really, there's pittance going to artists. But if you do a gig, people think, okay, 2 hours or an hour show, it's not a whole lot of work. But like any gig I've been on to, it's like it's a 10-hour day. You're driving, if it's anywhere up in Donegal or whatever that, you're doing long days, but. You think, oh, you're getting loads there. It's like €200 for a gig. That's plenty.
That's
well,
plenty. What else would you spend on glitter?
And I suppose that's one of the difficult things for bands, especially original bands, is the costs. Like if you want to set up a band, there's so much sunk costs into actually just getting a band operating, and minimum wage is something around 22,000 for bands of say four-piece band. You're talking net, even just to hit that, like 80 grand for the bands, more than 80 to 90,000. It's just the money, the income revenue for bands just isn't there. The infrastructure isn't there, and that's something like I'll talk about maybe later if we're talking about going forward. The infrastructure isn't there, the venues aren't there. It's too difficult for bands actually, and to actually have these networks. The network isn't there, and it's run like a lot of things in capitalist society. There's a monopoly on venues. There's a monopoly on record labels, and it's great for the ones that make it, but for every one band that makes it, there's another 100 or 200 people that can't get a foot in. And this final point is it creates this monoculture that you mentioned it, and I liken to analogy to rainforests, and the biodiversity in nature, rainforests, and then the monocrop of capitalist society, of its profit. It's about how can I take something that's for capitalism, rainforest has no value because it doesn't generate any profit, but I can create palm trees and I can use this as the resources. It's like an artist, if they can't guarantee profit for a label, it's no use. So we don't want creative artists that are going to take months or whatever. That we need, rather than creative people, we need productive people that are going to generate music and this monopop.
I think that hits it bang on the head, though.
Yeah, and there is some solutions that I know we're talking about the problems, but there is actually some solutions, even specifically for music. In France, they do it where it's 50% of all music on radio stations is French. Yeah. So legislatively, that's a fix tomorrow. You just pass a piece of legislation that says fucking 50, 60%, because there's enough Irish artists and enough diversity of music and sounds. Fuck it, 70%. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be all like American pop music. That would instantaneously increase the revenue streams of artists and independent labels. There's things in contracts still where you still have breakages, CD breakages in record deals, where the amount of CDs, we don't even make CDs, it's all digital. So you're operating on contracts essentially that are nearly fucking 25 or 30 years out of date. So that's when we need to kind of engage with the politicians and go, well look, we're artists. How can we engage with these legal types and legislators and other people that can change things that have a tangible effect on it? Simple legislative fixes that they can't just dismiss us as saying, yous are always giving out. Just and go, well, actually, here's a very practical solution. Do that tomorrow. You know what I mean? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us to kind of a much wider conversation. Like, if we had an art utopia and we could ask for anything that we wanted coming out of this post-COVID society, that we didn't have to, if we just take the pressures of that profit-driven industry off our shoulders for a minute, what would you think it could look like for artists if we could, those ideas? What are those ideas? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
If I could jump in, I think at the moment the utopian aspect is far away in the distance because artists are barely making minimum wage. And so I think a lot of those kind of issues need to be addressed first. Like the Arts Council brought out a fairly progressive document at the end of 2019 called Paying the Artist, was essentially kind of this guidebook on, if you're receiving public funds, you shouldn't be using free labour, you should be paying people a living wage, you should be paying for their expenses, so on and so forth. Relatively progressive, but the Arts Council ultimately is more bark than bite and so can't really enforce a lot of these things, which hopefully Praxis will be able to come in and kind of address them. And so as far as like, utopian guaranteed contracts, which is a rarity, equal pay for male and female artists, which at the moment I believe male artists receive double the amount, which is still seems to be ongoing. There's basic things like pensions, basic things that like a lot of people in different workplaces will take for granted, which for some reason in the arts and culture sector has just been assumed that they're all just kind of flippant and there's no security and that's fine because you enjoyed for the art's sake and you're gonna do it anyway and that's how a lot of artists get cut out. And so I mean even things like, and we're very aware in Praxis of keeping students in mind, because ultimately students are going through a 4-year degree and coming out having zero understanding of workplace issues, zero understanding of their rights in the workplace, and they're essentially just being used to undercut other already established artists. And so there's a variety of kind of multiple issues going on. I think obviously when you look back in the last like 12, 13 months, seeing how governments have responded to COVID is a fascinating kind of insight into their understanding or their consideration for artists and that kind of dynamic and how the system works. Like in Belfast there in February, the Communities Minister announced 10 million grant for different arts organisations and arts institutions in the 6 counties. And it was phrased as something to balance their books or something to deal with the debt they had accrued over the few months of closures. And so essentially what you had is 10 million of public funds going to landlords and using an arts institution as a conduit. And so ultimately you have this across the board. I mean, governments are more than able to make memorandums for rent for different arts institutions. But they're refusing to, essentially. And so instead they will just give out public funds to institutions who are indebted to private landlords, and you just have this kind of direct funneling of public funds to private hands. And it's fairly easy to see how billionaires made even more money in the last 13 months, because ultimately this is what governments across the West essentially are doing. And so there's so many issues around that kind of that not sure if it's a misunderstanding or it's just kind of blatant neoliberal politics. I imagine it's probably more the latter, but there's so many issues around that, and hopefully having a collective body of artists and be able to actually stand up and fight against a lot of these issues, which are being superseded by the demand to pay private landlords. Hopefully there's opportunities there to kind of fight for an eventual utopian kind of art system, or even something a little bit better than it is now.
Yeah,
that'll
so
do.
It might seem like we're a bit off, but look, we have the union now, and
we'll sort it out.
Fighting right in the corner. And what about yourselves? Do you have any ideas as what this art utopia is going to look like?
Just hit in on, like, as he was saying, all the arts funding that basically has been released. Ireland before the pandemic had the lowest investment throughout Europe, percentage of GDP on arts spent. And it was much, a shame kind of on Ireland, because they kept this nonsense kind of expression, you keep punching above our weight, but that's what, as he was touching on there, is because we keep working for fucking free and we keep pulling out this art. The politicians don't understand, certainly not Fine Gael and certainly not Fianna Fáil, they don't understand the worth of art, and it is that thing that they know the price of it, but they know the worth of nothing. It's very hard to quantify on a Google spreadsheet how art can impact an area of social deprivation, how art can actually bring down crime levels. It's very hard to quantify and track that. It's almost unquantifiable. You just have to trust that art will actually make a community better, a society better, and people feel in a particular way. But there are things that you can't quantify. There are things you can't literally put a price on. And if you can't put a price on it, then they don't understand it. They kind of do. They make noises like they do, and I think they're trying to say now that they do. But ultimately, it's always about how can we turn this into a money spinner. And I think for us, it's realising not to become ad agents, Don Drapers for governments to sell, like for the Gathering, for example, when it basically became a way of selling austerity. Austerity has worked. The 1916 celebrations, we were brought out again, but again, we weren't being remunerated properly. Enna Kenny goes to President Barack Obama and he gives him a book of poetry a book of fairy tales about Hawaiian children's fairy tales for Barack Obama's children. And that was a piece of art from an Irish artist. He didn't go there and give him a block of cheese. Do you know what I mean? So it is like our second biggest kind of, it's the thing that it's our second biggest export after food, but yet they are just not willing to pay for it. They're kind of copping onto that now because the people that they have advising them are telling them that. But that's only one government change away from being wiped out again, In the leadership race for Fine Gael, Varadkar and Coveney, they said they were going to increase the art spending by 7% every year, and then that just didn't happen. So, just to summarise and hit on what the guy said, I think a lot of this has to do with better services so actors can survive if they don't get sick, artists don't get timed out because the economy and the market is not allowing them. Public housing, not just for artists but for everybody, because artists have more in common with poor people across the board than they have with any other member of society. And we need to stop fooling ourselves thinking that we're the same as the politicians. We're not. We have common cause with the workers in the factory, and because they are making the same amount of money as we are. Actually, they make more than we do. Our average wage is between 5,000 and 15,000 a year, and if all you're doing is working as an artist, then that's just not, so you can't survive. So I hope that all this extra funding isn't just to get everybody through COVID, and then it's going to disappear again, and it's not going to be much use to anybody if all that extra arts funding that you get is just going to go to pay your landlord cash until we can get some sort of form of public housing. I don't think that I don't think that the arts can really survive in Ireland.
It's funny as well that there was a document released by the Arts and Culture Recovery Task Force. I think it was November last year, and they had some very, very questionable suggestions and recommendations to the government in the South. It included universal basic income, which I thought was kind of strange. I personally would be fairly against it because I think arts organisations already barely pay their staff, and I think if you were to give everyone a basic income, they'd even be less inclined to pay their staff. And if you were to dare ask for money as an artist and you're competing against 50 people who get universal basic income, that's going to be a difficult one. There was another one around VAT issues. Love a good VAT issue. VAT just solves all problems in the world. There was also a very interesting one around a mental and physical health programme which is very important. Pizzas on Fridays and a nice gym in your local studio is paramount, as opposed to actually paying people proper wages for proper work. If you want people to be less stressed, I don't think it's the lack of yoga in their life, it's probably the inability to pay their bills. But I guess if they continue not paying, we do have pizzas on Fridays, so there is perks.
Gotta keep us going.
Yeah, essentially, and so there was a few kind of different. It was almost like somebody who works in HR put together this proposal as to how to recover the arts and culture sector, and it was very bizarre. There was very little mention of artists' wages, or how are they getting work, or where is their work coming from, or anything around the cost of living that they have to deal with, and so it was very, very frustrating to see that as recently as November last year, their perception of saving the arts and culture industry relied on essentially human resources, tactics, and piecemeal.
It's really just glazing over it all and actually not addressing the systems.
It's like they're working off a different set of numbers as well. It's like they worked off a set of numbers that said we're all not on the median average wage, which is I think around 20,000, but an average industrial wage is around 32,000, which is obviously nonsense. You don't pay VAT until you make over 34,000 a year. The majority of artists don't make over that. So these kind of solutions are for some middle class artist that is making that amount of money, or some maybe in the end of their career artist. And it's the same with everything. VAT, like nonsense. It's like that's not going to help us. The taxation around art as well, this kind of perception, actors don't get like tax free, but things like that actually only benefit artists who are mid-career or late career. It doesn't do anything to actually address how young artists actually get through. Like everybody they pay some form of tax, it's not for everybody, but addressing that and actually coming up with something better than tax-free type credits, which is kind of another form of universal basic income. And also what Mark said about the Spleen Hamland laws creating a base. I would be afraid that the universal basic income will create a baseline that some is not institutions, because I think legally to be a bit, but what we'd have to say is that if artists do get universal basic income, you need to go to an employer and say, that's my business, that's my money. Don't worry about what I'm getting. You need to pay me, because the universal basic income is the floor. You still need to pay me the regular wage. You're not giving me like taking the universal basic income out and then basically giving something to top it up, So
there was another interesting one in the proposals around training and development for artists and people in the industry, kind of touching on what you were discussing earlier on. Just just go off and do IT.
Yeah,
that'll solve things.
Yeah, mid-career kind of like it's like okay, you should try digging a hole, mate. I was like, I'll get on that.
Yeah, the government's looking into it now.
Yeah.
Grand.
So.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of the question about utopian, I think for us and as artists is not to think in those utopian terms. I think the reality is there's a class struggle, and for me, like the ideal thing is not to think of artists and now musicians, bands, actors, whatever that. It's profit driven. It's like this. Is it profitable? It's not thought of, well, actually, is culture an essential part of our lives? And I think it is, and I think that it's a mentality, it's how people perceive musicians, artists, that these are essential. And we all felt it like with the lockdown, people were going, oh, life is so dull without the arts, you know what I mean? So it is an essential service, and I think that's the first thing. I think that the way to get there is a slogan the CPI used in terms of trade unions, either becoming radical or redundant. I think that can apply here, that artists have to become radical or they will be redundant. They'll leave the profession, leave the industry. And what I mean by radical, it means organising. If that's in local collectives, talking about, okay, well, do we have a venue? Can we work with other artists? The viability of cross collaboration between the arts is immense, but it isn't there, or isn't there to the extent that it could be. And then obviously when you have people meeting together and collaboration, then it goes to the next level of union organising. That's where praxis comes in. So that's one element of being radical. Just go, hold on, we need to meet, we need to organise, we need to talk about ourselves. Second thing is not being reliant on the gatekeepers to actually give us this. We have to drive artists, and this is like, it's not just in terms of the arts, it's in all aspects of our lives. We have to drive it, because there's no point in waiting on the politician to wait for the grant. It's not about money, it's about ownership. You touched on it. Ownership of the productive means, ownership of the spaces that we work and create in. If we don't have ownership, we've no control. We've no control, then we have no ability to really affect our lives and to have those careers as artists that we want, and not just for ourselves, but future generations, because we are setting our future generations up for the same type of stuff, and even worse, because the system isn't actually, driving public service. It's driving it into the ground. It's trying to privatise everything for profit, and that's just, it's a systemic thing. And until people, like I said, organise, meet, educate, and then the final thing, being politically active, getting understanding of how society works. I think that is, it's all part of a process. It's all part of a struggle, and it's all part of a class struggle. And if that isn't to the fore, then we won't make those. We'll never reach utopia, which
Absolutely. And like the Trade Union Left Forum campaigns on a lot of progressive campaigns like that, but some of the stuff we do is around some of the kind of laws that have a stranglehold on that organising that needs to be done. So like, for example, the Industrial Relations Act from 1990, that really inhibits a lot of the kind of organising and campaigning that we can do. So I suppose what I'd recommend that is people to get have a look at the campaign on Trade Union Left Forum online and stuff, and have a look at that and engage with those discussions, because we need to challenge the laws that are there to kind of keep us down from this organising. Because in order to have that class struggle, we need to be able to say, well, we're down tools, we're walking off, we're not balloting, giving you 2 weeks notice so you can plot a campaign against us. It's absolutely ridiculous that we're just sitting down and allowing this to happen, and the kind of operating outside with the laws there that currently were literally designed to keep us down, I think is really important. And that idea of social partnership as well, that somehow we're equal partners if we're at a table with the government. We are not equal partners. We've had years and years of neoliberal governments putting in policies that are designed just to keep us in our boxes and keep us down. And I really feel like this universal basic income kind of thing is probably another thing to dangle in front of people, to be like, look, we are giving you something. Can you stay quiet another little while until we as you say, really commodify arts and really or else just completely forget about people after this post-COVID reality. But I think we've really discussed a really wide range of issues here, and kind of really got a feel for how people are feeling, but also the solutions. And obviously praxis is going to be a huge part of that. But I think the main thing is that we need a collective response to this. We really need to kind of look at abolishing these laws that favour industry and business over arts and culture, and we really need to be making sure that we're working together and fighting together and helping to achieve both this art utopia that we discussed today. And look, I just want to thank all of you today for coming in and having this chat, and we've really enjoyed it, and this has been a really good discussion, and I hope people are kind of listening to this and learning from it, and obviously if there's any artists that are there to join the union, get that plug in there for Praxis Trade Union, and we really look forward to seeing where that goes too. Thanks very much.
Cheers, Michelle. Nice. Appreciate that. Cheers, lads.